Hello everyone, good evening. A very warm welcome to you all to the Royal Society of Edinburgh on this very damp and soggy evening. My name is Roy Luxford. I'm the Director of Planning for the Edinburgh International Festival. I've got the pleasure of drawing some attention to the emergency routes and also your devices. Can you make sure they don't make any noises for tonight's event? The Edinburgh International Festival is absolutely delighted to be working with the National Theatre of Scotland, the National Theatre of Great Britain, to bring Rona Monroe's James plays to the festival this year, and they'll have their world premiere with us at the Festival Theatre. This year's festival takes as its starting point the centenary of the Great War. So we are looking at art and conflict throughout the ages, great art that's produced in times of absolute strife, and out of this, of course, themes of nations, nationhood, and national and cultural identity. The James plays, in 3 parts, are absolutely the centrepiece of our theatre programme and offer a complex and compelling narrative on Scottish culture. So allow me to hand over to Professor Jan Mcdonald, former Professor of Drama at Glasgow University, and who will introduce our guests and chair the discussion. Jan.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Well, I am going to begin by saying a few brief words about the Royal Society of Edinburgh. The Royal Society of Edinburgh was founded in 1783 for the advancement of learning and useful knowledge. I do like useful, you see. It was founded, of course, in the flourishing of the Scottish Enlightenment. It is Scotland's National Academy of Science and Letters and is an educational charity independent of government. Currently, there are around 1,500 fellows, elected by peer review, who represent a very, very wide range of disciplines: medicine, law, all branches of science, the humanities and creative arts, as well as business and industry. Our past fellows, to give you some examples, include Sir Walter Scott and Lord Kelvin. And our present fellows include Sir David Attenborough, Sir Peter Higgs, he of the Higgs boson, and Liz Lochhead, Scotland's Macca, or Poet Laureate. Our contemporary mission statement, what I would call the aim really, is providing public benefit. And this is achieved by several of our activities, including organising in Edinburgh and indeed now throughout Scotland, a programme of lectures and debates on important academic and topical issues. Also conducting independent inquiries on matters of national and international importance, providing expert advice to both the Scottish and the UK governments, and supporting innovative research in science and letters in Scotland and promoting international collaboration. We also deliver a range of educational workshops and talks by fellows to schools throughout the country. It is a great pleasure for me to be introducing this discussion forum on the James plays. As I was saying to Rona and Michael earlier, when I first read the James plays, I thought, my goodness, I hope it's not Henry James's plays, because they really are dire. And so, in fact, I was very much relieved that, in fact, it was, in fact, the real live James plays. Now, as you will no doubt know, this is a new cycle of 3 history plays about James I, James II, and James III of Scotland, written by Rona Monroe and directed by Laurie Sanson. And this will premiere at the Edinburgh International Festival in August. I think, in fact, you're going to hear a lot more about that, but I'd just like to say that this production of these 3 dramas is obviously a historic event, not only in the nature of the subject matter, but actually because history is being made here as we speak. This is the first co-production by the National Theatre of Scotland, the Edinburgh International Festival, and the National Theatre of Great Britain. But I'm told by Roy now I have to refer to that as the National Theatre down south. The plays will be presented in August and at the National Theatre in London in September and October, in Edinburgh in August. Okay, so moving on, in fact, a very pleasant task is to introduce our speakers, who in fact have a shared passion for Scottish history. Dr. Michael Brown is reader in medieval history at the University of St Andrews. He is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and indeed a prolific author. His monographs include James I, appropriate enough, which won the Agnes Muir Prize for Scottish History in 1994, and of course forms the basis of the first play in the trilogy on James I. The Black Douglases, another of his works, in 1998, The Wars of Scotland in 2004, excuse me, and most recently, Disunited Kingdom, Peoples and Politics in the British Isles, 1280 to 1460. A review of the last reads, "The author ingeniously elucidates the developing ideas of national identity and sense of community via a nuanced political and linguistic perspective." I think that makes it absolutely prescribed reading for both sides of the referendum debate. Michael was also awarded the highly prestigious David Berry Prize, and was awarded annually for the best essay of the year in Scottish history. But his interests lie not only in academic publications. He has broadcast on BBC Radio Scotland a series entitled Tales of a Crime Writer, which focused on the ways in which violent episodes during the rule of the Stuart dynasty in Scotland provide inspiration for the arts in different forms, including opera, novels, and plays. So we have indeed the inspiration and the fact. Michael has described 15th century Scotland as, I quote, "a period of great personalities and striking events, often violent, which capture the imagination." He is one person whose imagination has certainly been inspired by these troubled times. To turn to Rona Monroe, this is a very great pleasure. Rona Monroe is one of the group of young women dramatists whose innovations in dramaturgy and choice of subject matter contributed to the flowering of Scottish theatre in the late 20th century, a movement which has justifiably been recognised as a major factor in the re-establishment of a sense of Scottish cultural identity. Like Michael Brown, Rona adores medieval history. She holds an honours degree in history from the University of Edinburgh, awarded in 1980. And she had no problem in seeking a job on graduation. She began writing immediately. And in fact, that was her. I think she does say that her only job other than writing was as a cleaner. In several of her early dramas, she drew on historical material, legends, myths, and ballads, and her fascination with times past has not decreased in her more recent work. For example, some of you may have seen The Lost Witch, which was performed at the 2009 Edinburgh Festival. During her research for this drama in 2008, she was a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities, popularly known as IASH, some of you may well know it, at Edinburgh University. And she worked there with the late Professor Susan Manning, who of course was a very distinguished fellow of this society and a council member. Rona is no stranger then to the festivals. Her play Iron in 2002, which began at the Traverse, was the winner of the John Whiting Award and has subsequently been performed worldwide. Her plays have been performed by the National Theatre of Scotland, the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Royal Court Theatre, the Lyric Hammersmith, and Manchester Royal Exchange. She has also brought her talents to bear in creating work for television, film, and radio. Her recent television work includes the BAFTA-nominated Bumping the Odds and Rehab. And she also wrote the last Doctor Who television serial of the original run. This was called Survival, and she turned that into a novel in 1989. She has contributed to the cinema with 2 films, Lady Bird, Lady Bird with Ken Loach, and Oranges and Sunshine. Her recent radio work includes her contributions to the Stanley Baxter Playhouse. She is also the writing half of the award-winning Misfits, Scotland's oldest continuously surviving feminist theatre company. Great. When asked, "What do you think is the job of a playwright?" she replied, "To help create something that will leave an audience feeling genuinely glad they spent their money on the ticket." Underselling yourself a bit, I think. Regarding the James plays, Rona said, My greatest ambition is that the audiences will come out with at least some of the same fevered enthusiasm for our history that I have, and with these stories lodged in their head. I rather think this will be the case from what I have heard. And so now it's my great pleasure to invite Dr. Brown to begin.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm halfway through, I was thinking, who is this fabulous person? So thank you very much, Jan. And thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to you tonight about 15th century Scotland. And in this year of 2014, not to have to talk about Bannockburn, which is a kind of curse of medieval Scottish historians at this particular point in the cycle. And in a way, that's where I want to start. I want to explore the way in which, if you like, 15th century Scotland has always been, if you like, in the shadow in terms of other historical events. When people think about medieval Scotland, for example, they're drawn to the stories of Bruce and Wallace, to the exclusion almost of everything else. And if we look at the way in which the school curriculum has been reformed recently, and as a Scottish historian, I'm very pleased to see the volume of Scottish history increased, but you move seamlessly, if you like, from the Wars of Independence, from the 1290s to the 1320s or beyond, straight on to Queen Mary and John Knox and the Reformation in the 16th century. And that has been the popular perception of Scottish history, that, if you like, that nothing of importance happens between about 1329 and 1550-ish. I get a bit hazy in the 16th century. I can see Jenny Wormold looking at me. I think we need to think about why there is that gap. And if you think of the great televisual historical narratives of British history, Simon Sharma, every time you mention Scotland, you cut to a picture of a kind of rain-soaked glen with a solitary horseman plodding towards you. But again, between Wallace, Bruce and Edward I, and the Reformation, Scotland doesn't figure in those accounts. So there's a problem here, historically, in terms of the way this subject is presented. And I wonder, as someone who's worked on the 15th century for nearly 30 years now, why that might be. And I think part of the issue might be the fact that all the kings are called James. It doesn't lend itself to kind of a sense of distinction or variation. I think that's a kind of image problem that superficially people have to get past. And I suppose the other point that would occur to me was the fact that, taken at a superficial level, people might think the key events, the defining moments in Scottish history are indeed things like the Wars of Independence, which you could see as defining Scotland's relationship with England, its sense of antagonism towards England for subsequent centuries, until the Union of the Crowns and post-Union Scotland. And similarly, the Reformation, as creating something which is distinctively Scottish, which is part of the ongoing Scottish experience. But I think if we dig deeper, we can look at the 15th century very much in the same terms, and perhaps increasingly in a secular Scotland seeking to explore issues of self-government. Then the 15th century is a period which has a lot to offer in terms of the way in which we explore those issues. So, what the Jameses as a group, what James I to III as kings represent are approaches to self-government, approaches to the government of Scotland which are distinctive and which are controversial. And increasingly, regardless, I think, of what happens on the 18th of September, Scotland is entering an era of self-government, in which issues like taxation, education, law become increasingly distinct from English practice. So the issues that are encapsulated by the events of the 15th century are about how Scotland governed itself during its period of greatest independence from the rest of the British Isles, its greatest separation from the English state. And I think within that you have what I think is perhaps a defining and yet underexplored issue for 21st century Scotland, the relationship between Scotland's centre and its very diverse regional and local environments. And I think as self-government develops in Scotland in the 21st century, that's going to be an issue which initiates debate and controversy and diverse political views. And yet in the 15th century, what these three kings represent is an approach to Scottish government which is increasingly centralised, integrated, and revolves around institutions which by the end of the 15th century are fixed here in Edinburgh. The king moves much less widely and much less frequently around his kingdom than he would have done in the days of Robert Bruce, for example. His court moves between Edinburgh, Linlithgow, Stirling. If he wants a nice spot of hunting, weekend away, he goes across the Forth to Falkland. It's a very small part of the kingdom. So it's turning Scotland as a kingdom into a much more unified, integrated society, but in many cases against the will of people in further flung parts of the kingdom. And the 15th century, in many ways, the tensions are there, the strains are there in previous century, but the 15th century is a period in which, for the first time, you get, if you like, an institutionalised antipathy between government and Highlands, another long-standing theme of Scottish history. It's James I who, if you like, starts the practice by which the kings seek to civilise Highland society. As he puts it, as he is quoted as saying, he will make grain grow where previously it hasn't. He's quoting Roman authors to say, I'm dealing with the barbarians here. And it's that mindset which I think is part and parcel of this centralising tendency. So I think 15th century Scotland has a lot to offer in terms of the way we think about modern Scotland, and in terms of the way Scots understand their past as part of the process of building a very distinct future. To come to the three kings themselves, and starting with James I, I have a very long-standing relationship with James I, as Jan indicated. I think in 1987 was the year I started my PhD thesis on the personal rule of James I, and we have a kind of love-hate relationship. He may be oblivious to this, but we have a kind of tricky relationship in which I think you can get too close to a historical subject, and I sometimes admire him. I find him a transformative figure in Scottish history, a man who demonstrates what medieval personal monarchy could achieve in a kingdom. Returning from exile after 18 years as a prisoner in England, transforming Scotland in the ways he sought, creating the image of strong monarchy, as Rona, I think, is going to demonstrate very clearly in her drama, bringing down the most powerful figures in his kingdom, his kinsmen, the Dukes of Albany, and establishing a regime based around large levels of financial demands and a royalist ideology which he presents as about royal justice, but which is controversial. And if you look at the way people talk about James I in his lifetime, he's a figure who divides. My other great love-hate relationship is with Walter Bower, much less well-known figure, a chronicler who lived through James's reign and gives us this wonderful portrait of the man as a force of nature, as this incredibly active figure who likes to wrestle with his nobles and cast them on the ground. It must be great fun having James I come around to visit and throw you on the ground. And Bower wants to present James as a very positive figure, as the lawgiver, as the king who restores peace and order to his realm. But he has doubts. He sees James as a man who is greedy, who presents his personal desire for vengeance and his delight in acquiring other people's possessions as a crusade for good justice and secure government. And if Bower is someone who is, if you like, positive but with doubts, then clearly the people who killed James in 1437, give way to much more serious doubts. There is a body of opinion which regards James as a tyrant, as a man who misuses his authority. And James's death, I think, indicates the divisions he creates within Scottish society, that he is a divisive figure, that not everybody buys into the ideology of kingship. But I think what's important about him is the fact that his successors very clearly do. If you move on to James II, James of the fiery face, the big red birthmark covering half of his face, think he's a psychoanalyst's dream, isn't he? I mean, classic example of what happens if you have a kind of tortured childhood. And James grows up in extremely unstable conditions. His father is murdered when he's 7. His mother, whose custody he's in, whose care he's under, is imprisoned when he's 9, and he is taken away from her and brought up by a group of aristocratic custodians. And James clearly brings a lot of that baggage with him when he secures power in the kingdom as an adult at the end of the 1440s. And of course, the event that I think Rona is going to depict in her play, and as you can see, I haven't seen the plays, but I've had some tasters and very excited about them. The defining act of James II's reign is the moment in which he stabs personally William, Earl of Douglas, man at his table in Stirling Castle under safe conduct, and the king stabs him. The king's servants then rush in and finish the Earl of Douglas off. And I think that's such a almost defining moment of 15th century Scotland on all sorts of levels. I think it tells us what a small, almost incestuous group of people shape 15th century Scotland, or appear to shape 15th century Scotland. That the king, dealing face to face with this man who is the most powerful noble in his kingdom, comes to blows with him almost certainly as an act of instantaneous anger. You know, this is about emotion. It's not necessarily about cold, hard political rationale. And it's a defining moment because it sets in train the events which bring down the House of Douglas and creates a kingship which is secure from rivals within the lowlands. James II, not easily and not necessarily automatically, creates the kingship, finishes his father's work in terms of presenting a kingship which is frightening. You know, this isn't about consensual government. This is about conflict. It is about the creation of royal authority. Lots of people, increasingly, I think people are buying into this because they see which way the wind is blowing. But there remain questions about the way in which kings behave. And this brings us finally, I think, to James III. And for me, and I think for a lot of historians, James III is the most enigmatic of the three. He's the hardest to figure out in terms of his personal objectives and his character. You could term him James the well-intentioned almost. At the beginning of his reign, beginning of his period as an adult ruling Scotland, he seems to be thinking about the ways of running the kingdom, which are new, which are different. And yet at the same time, throughout the period in which he's ruling Scotland, time after time, he seems to get on people's nerves. It's always struck me as interesting, though possibly not surprising, that none of James's family, presumably the people who know him best, none of them can stand him. He has 2 sisters and 2 brothers. He ends up killing one brother, exiling the other. Okay. His youngest brother dies in mysterious circumstances whilst in royal custody. It's one of those kind of... We'll agree on, yes, okay. Let's be precise here. And his 2 sisters, his elder sister Mary, clearly resents the way her first husband is treated. And his younger sister, Margaret, when a marriage to an English nobleman is being planned, gets herself pregnant by a Scotsman to avoid the marriage, as far as we can see, or possibly for any number of reasons, but clearly is not going along with her brother's policy. So the royal family, in a sense, is uniting against the king. And that sense of James standing on people's toes, upsetting people, inciting complaint and criticism runs throughout the reign until it culminates in first one attempt to remove him. He's imprisoned in Edinburgh Castle, and in a way it's because nobody can actually decide what to replace him with, I think, that James is allowed to survive. And then, having realised what a disaster it is that James actually makes it through that crisis 6 years later, then they do the job properly, and in a civil war, when you would imagine the king had lots of natural advantages, James is defeated by a force led by his son, and you can see squatting behind him there on the magnificent Trinity altarpiece, James IV. His son, surrounded by a group of hostile noblemen, defeat the king in battle on the field of Bannockburn. There you are, I've mentioned it again. And James III happened to be slain, another one of these accidental on purpose deaths in the Stuart family. And I think what these kings demonstrate, and what the events of their reigns demonstrate, is something which historians, professional historians, sometimes overlook, which is history is a great narrative, it's a great story with personalities, with events. And 15th century Scotland has some of the brightest and bloodiest, the red and gold of the lion rampant, if you like. You have the all together as in the one place. So bringing those stories to life seems to me to be an excellent way of both informing and entertaining the public. I'm really looking forward to seeing Rona's plays.
Oh, I sincerely hope they don't disappoint. I can't believe I had the temerity to question any of your information. But no, I have. I'll come on to talk about that in more detail. I have, as a maker of stories, you do look at history in a very different way, and occasionally there's a little shred that you have ambitions to enlarge into something which serves your purposes in many ways, and that actually, funnily, is one of those shreds, but I'll probably never get to write the story that it's based on. So, what I'll do is I'll tell you a little bit about why I even had the temerity to attempt to write these plays, and then a bit about the process of engaging with everything Michael's been talking about and how you make that into drama, or how I've made it into drama, because of course there's an infinite number of ways one could have done it. The ambition really came out of the enthusiasm, in as much as I did study history at university. I have a very indifferent degree. The reason I have a very indifferent degree is that I always struggled to engage with the part that was, well, actually, no, I was a bit young to be at university, and I was getting involved in the University Drama Society and the Television Society and doing all those other things that a certain type of student does, and that is why my essays were slightly substandard. That's the truth. But within that, there would also be that thing of when an awful lot of precise detail was required, I would be rather a poor student. When I was allowed to speculate endlessly as to the emotional reasons people might or might not have done something, then I was a much better student. The delight for me in I think the medieval period of history is twofold. One of it is really quite juvenile. It is that little girl running around in the forest with a stick, pretending it's a sword, swords and sorcery kind of a side of things. The fact that one can imagine oneself in those environments still delights me. I can't deny it. The other, I think, is that I find it a very moving period of history, just in the same way that in certain parts of the world now, you know, when people are living in the extreme conditions, everyone's story is just larger. If the stuff of your day-to-day life is more epic, if you're dealing with the possibility of death and disease and all the kind of forces that worked on a medieval society, that really it brings people down to what is basic about being human, in the best and the worst sense. And I do find that enormously moving. I find the courage of the Middle Ages enormously moving. And one of the things that I think when I first had the pleasure of meeting Michael and his colleague Clistrine McGladdery, and we were talking about the Middle Ages, and I think one of the actors who brought with us said something about, you know, people running around waving swords and you know, in a brutish way, and you both kind of jumped on it and kind of went, no, wait, it's not all that, it's not just that. And I think that's, again, what interests me and delights me and I find moving, is that it isn't actually all about people cutting each other's throats. What you observe is people struggling to find structures and forms of society that will allow them to stop killing each other. Because that's basically, as along with the greed and the avarice and the desire, on the one hand, for individuals and individual families and individual interest groups to grab as much of the country's resources as they can and control them, there's also this other force that's constantly going on, which is you kind of think, oh my God, it was back then, and basically, why would people choose to start forming laws? You know, because it's back then, because things are so much more basic, because of so many of the structures we take for granted were not in place. When you see people trying to make them, even if it's coming from a centralised position and, you know, dominated by interest groups in a way that we would question now, it's still something very moving about it. So that is also, I think, partly my justification for focusing on the royals, as opposed to, you know, and a lot of people have asked me that. They say, why are you telling the stories of the kings and not the ordinary people? I've got three answers to that. One is what the kings did affected the ordinary people. That is the story, because they were the ones that, you know, were calling the shots so much. The other is Scotland was such a small community then. I mean, what's the population of Scotland in the 15th century? Where it's...
I'm going to say 650,000.
Yeah, not even topping a million. You know.
Please, nobody quote me on that.
No, but, you know, basically we're talking the population of Perth, are we? Possibly? Edinburgh, maybe. You know, but that's the whole country. So whatever your king's doing, you know, if you're in Edinburgh, you're probably witnessing at least. So that, and the final one brings me on in my great long rambling diatribe to one of my reasons of why I wanted to do them. It's the stories are great. The stories are fantastic. And I think more than anything else, if you give people love of the stories, they will then go and seek out everything else for themselves. If they don't even know what a period of history is about, then it remains just this unknown swamp where people may or may have not done something, but who knows. It's the story that makes it accessible to the folk who don't have the interest before they ever come to the story, if you see what I mean. And that was brought home to me when I went and saw the RSC's history cycle, when they did all the history plays in a cycle a few years ago. And I actually saw them in the Roundhouse in London. And you could buy your bulk ticket and basically go in and start off with Richard II, don't you? And you kind of go on up and watch the lot. And it was quite an eye-opening experience for me. One of the things it did was I, as a lot of living writers do, and I will come clean and admit it, I had the big Shakespeare chip on my shoulder. And the living writer Shakespeare chip is, he's good, but he's not that good. You know what I mean? And it's to do with the stranglehold he has on what I still think is the most democratic, the most exciting, and the most accessible part of our culture, which is live theatre. And I do feel, and it's a really controversial thing to say, and we probably won't get into it here, and I'm aware it's a sweeping generalisation, and I'm aware the honourable exceptions are legion. However, badly done Shakespeare has an awful lot to answer for in terms of alienating ordinary people from something that should be something that they really enjoy and feel is for them. So I went in with that big chip. And then I saw them and I went, oh, actually, they're pretty damn good, aren't they? But the other thing that I realised when I came out was how much of the history I already knew, never having seen the plays, because of my big Shakespeare chip on my shoulder. So that an awful lot of the history of that period of English history, I knew because of Shakespeare, and I'd never seen the plays. So I can't think of a way to make a segue that doesn't sound like an appalling act of arrogance. And in a sense, call it a leap of faith or an appalling act of arrogance. I then thought, well, Scotland needs that. I didn't necessarily think I could do it as well as that, and I'm not claiming I have. However, I thought it was a job that needed beginning. And so even if these plays do not do it to the standard that Scotland deserves, hopefully they will at least provoke people to think about starting to tell these stories, because I do think that's important. I then went and did what I probably should have done when I was actually a student of history, which is to look at James I, James II, and James III properly. And I did have a peripheral knowledge of some of the events, but an awful lot of it, I was coming to it, I think, with a different attitude, partly because I was a hell of a lot older. So I was coming to it with a certain maturity and a certain skill level as a writer that I wouldn't have had back then, because, you know, you top 50, and if you're not good at what you're doing, what's the point? So, you know, I actually probably was a better storyteller coming to look at history and think, how do you use this? And of course, to make it work as a piece of drama and live up to that quote, which I'd forgotten ever saying, of I do think if people are going to shell out upwards of £15 for a night out, they need to be glad they did it. I think that's the least you owe them. And it's actually really rude if you don't. That it's not to say they're going to come out feeling good or understanding what they've seen, or, you know, but they need to be glad they spent the money. That's, you know. So to make that work, you have to think, well, then what are the plays about? Because they can't be history lessons. I hope they will excite people and get them interested in history and get them thinking about this period of history, but they have to be watching them for another reason. They have to be, and again, I can't think of a non-pretentious way of saying this, universally human. So you think, what are this, in the same way that baldy-headed English guy did, you know, the master, you've got to go, that play is about a man struggling with this, a woman dealing with that, it's a love story, it's this, it's that. So I looked at the personalities of the three kings and their queens and other people close to them, and I thought, so what are the stories? So for me, James I, as Michael has rather reassuringly summarised him, is a man who's almost torn between two impulses. And the story I chose to tell comes partly out of another thing that a lot of you here probably know about him, which is that he wrote one of the first pieces of Scottish literature, which is The King is Square, which was a love poem to Joan Beaufort, who became his wife. And it's funny, actually, because talking to different people about it and people in the company, some people think it's a great poem and some people go, oh, it's not all that. And I love it. I did the really stupid thing just for myself of attempting to translate some of it from the medieval Scots into contemporary Scots, not to use in any way, but just to try and understand, as a writer, how another writer had put thoughts together. And that felt like a really intimate thing to do, and that gave me my own love-hate relationship with that James, and a sense that I basically, having done that, I couldn't believe he was just a man interested in tax, money and personal aggrandisement. I felt that there was also the soul of a poet in there, but then he has to go and be King of Scots. Now, I could be romanticising, but the play that I've then set out to create is what happens when you've got the soul of a poet and all these ideas about the kind of king you want to be, that is about justice and it is about quelling the power of the nobles and getting, you know, more kind of law and order for the crown and for the lower levels of society. And yet you are dealing with medieval Scotland and your own ego. And that's kind of what James I became. James II as... am I going too long now, by the way? Okay. James II, as Michael, again, now that rather reassuringly summarised, is a psychoanalyst's dream, because you have the scenario of a child king who comes to the throne when he's only 7 years old, and on the back of violence, of his father's assassination, of terrible things happened to his mother, and then witnesses the slaughter of his own cousins when he's a child himself, because the powers controlling the throne are then saying, but everything is done in your name. So we know, I mean, that is true, isn't it, that the young king actually did witness the murder of his cousins, probably with no clear idea of why it was happening, and yet being told it was done for his good and good for the kingdom, and then grows up to be this young king with a young wife who stabs another young man in whatever motivated it was clearly an act of passion in the moment, because it doesn't look to me as, well, I mean, I couldn't see a probable way in which that was a planned assassination, but yeah. So that's number two. Number three, I'm picking up at a different point from everything that Michael summarised for you. So really, I was focusing on the point where you've got a king that's been struggling with all the things that James I did and James II and his own unpopularity. So I'm looking at why is he unpopular, and also why does he at a certain point stop? It's almost like he stops caring about how to be diplomatic. And you can look at that one of two ways. Either he was never very good at it in the first place, or he just went, oh, to hell with you all, and decided to go a different way. And I kind of thought that was more dramatically interesting. That's a terrible generalisation of a lot of very complicated history. But so my James III is a guy who is more interested in his own pet projects, his own favourites, which is something he was extremely unpopular for, and what he can get Parliament to give him in the way of money, as opposed to good government. He's lost interest in good government. He doesn't believe in good government. And again, I'm looking at the reasons why that happened, and thinking of a character who clearly inspired intense. He was Marmite, wasn't he, as a king? He seems to have been a Marmite king. So the people that loved him appear to have loved him intensely, and the people that loathed him appear to have loathed him intensely. And unfortunately, that group very quickly grew to exceed the first. So I'm thinking of someone who was almost. I'd better not give to, because someone came up with the idea of Russell Brand as an analogy. Now that, and there are elements of that in my James III. That's all I'll say on that one. But as you'll see just from that very brief thing, we are moving a long, long, long way from anything that could be defended as academic truth, for want of a better word. And the delight for me as a playwright is that I can almost, I haven't completely, but almost completely release my guilt at how inadequate I was at doing the one, and just glory in playing with the other, which is it doesn't matter if it's academically truthful, because it's got to be a good story. However, what I sincerely hope is that I haven't distorted things to the point that they will be offensive to those of you who have basically taken care of the history. But what I hope, my ambition for them, is that there will be stories that give a sense of the history, a sense of the people, and also just inspire an enthusiasm in the stories, and for other people to tell stories about what is a fascinating and a neglected period of our history, because we need more of them. I'd better shut up now, because I must have overrun.
Thank you both very much indeed. Now it's over to the audience to ask questions. Some people from the RSE will come round with, and the festival, will come round with microphones. And could you please put your hand up when you want to ask your question, and wait till you've got the microphone, because sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to hear. I think the only other thing I have to say on this particular one, I've got instructions on this. Hold the microphone quite close to your mouth, sort of like a pop star, I'm told, but I hope that helps you. It doesn't really me. And then actually keep your questions brief and to the point, so we get as many in as possible before you'll get your tea. Okay, here's a gentleman here, I think.
Hello, thank you. Michael, particularly, I'm interested to know your view as to why contemporary history in England and perhaps on the continent was perhaps more settled than it was here in Scotland.
You mean why Scotland is more disturbed?
Yes.
Well, if you read Shakespeare's Henry VI, Richard III, you might get an impression that things aren't necessarily going so swimmingly in England. I think the issues in Scotland are different. And I think, as I was saying, you've got James I and James II in particular, I think, trying to create an approach to kingship which cuts across the expectations of a lot of their leading subjects, the people who have been accustomed to effectively ruling parts of Scotland, either as agents of the crown or as the holders of great private estates which have powers of justice attached to them. So families like the Earls of Douglas or the Lords of the Isles. And James's view of James I's view of kingship and James II's view of kingship is one in which the king isn't simply there, if you like, as the first amongst equals, as someone who's there to provide legal title to land, to confirm things in terms of if you like, regional power that these families want. He's there, the king is there to directly access the people of the kingdom. And this is Rona's, I think Rona's sounds very interesting on James I. James I, I think we have to be careful not to approach him as someone who is kind of cynically manipulating events to increase his own personal power and wealth. Sure, there's a bit of that. But I think he is presenting a message which cuts through intermediaries in terms of authority. So the famous speech he makes on the first day he returns to Scotland about the key keeping the castle and the cow keeping the thorn bush. It's not particularly flowing language by our standards. But what he's saying is, royal justice provides a means by which your goods and your lives are secure. And his legislation, for which James is famous, guarantees that. So James is presenting an ideological picture of kingship as a guarantee of justice and security without fraud or favour to great and to the weak. Now, how far he is ever able to deliver that, I think it's very hard for us to know, but that's the message he's selling. And I think that's why kingship of the kind practiced by James I and II may be extremely unpopular with various Earls of Douglas, but may increasingly have a constituency amongst middle-ranking Scots, burgesses, lesser landowners, who look to kings as a source of protection, employment, reward. And by the end of the 15th century, you're seeing a much clearer group of what subsequently get called lairds, if you like, local landowners who are now direct tenants-in-chief of the crown, starting to build houses which reflect their status, tower houses in particular, and starting to operate within as a community under royal leadership in ways which 100 years before would have been very different. So kingship is struggling to assert itself, and I think that's a different kind of struggle, in many ways a more existential struggle than the kind of dynastic conflicts which we see in mid-15th century England.
Lady over there.
I'd like to ask something which has always puzzled me, and that's this business of psychoanalysis. Because I think there's a most horrendous divide between us and the past, and it's called Freud. The point being that we are conditioned by psychoanalysis or other forms of that kind of approach, whereas James II didn't have the faintest idea that he was supposed to be completely screwed up, because no one told him that he had a rotten childhood. Most royal children had horrible childhoods, and indeed it's possible to argue that the more horrible it was, the better training it was for the future. So I don't know how far one can try and delve into a personality through the insights of modern analysts.
That's actually, and I must apologise because I was using the phrase "a psychoanalyst dream" rather glibly,
Me too, yes.
Yeah, because I completely agree with you, and I think that idea of cause and effect in those. I couldn't say I could understand what a Freudian interpretation of James II would be. I think what's interesting, though, is for us, because you tend to think of people in history as being not like us. That's a very common misconception, is the idea that I think we love. I'm not talking about people in this room. I think generally the world loves the idea that people in history are stupider than us, because it's so reassuring. You know, we must have improved. We know things now. We couldn't possibly be making the same mistakes. And part of that is the idea they couldn't possibly have thought or felt like us. And of course, the truth is that they absolutely must have done. And they would have been the product of their own time and their own culture. But when one looks at that and then thinks, well, what would it have been like to have been a 7-year-old boy and experienced that and that and that, and might that have shaped your personality in a way that led to you stabbing another young man? I think that's an interesting thought process. So I absolutely agree with what you're saying, but I also kind of wanted to pull against that idea that they couldn't possibly be as complicated or as emotionally sophisticated or detailed as we are, which I think is another, the number of times that you see a period of history and everyone's talking kind of woodenly, and no one talks colloquially, because of course you couldn't have in history, because they all talked in history speak, and the fact that it was colloquial speech for them never, and of course their emotions are all rather strange and clunky and inexplicable, and without the nuance that you would give a 20th or 21st century character. So I do apologise for my glib phrase.
Any more questions? Yes, the lady here.
Could I ask Rona why you chose these three particular kings? And do you have ambitions to cover any others? Is this the end of the project or a beginning?
Well, I would love to, I say this at every opportunity and kind of gaze kind of meaningfully at anyone who might have any commissioning power when I say, wouldn't that be lovely? Yes. No, I would love to, but who knows if that will ever happen. Why these three? I think for the reasons Michael's talking about. I think possibly initially it was just a really glib idea of like going, well, there's all the Henrys and all the Richards, let's have a look at the Jameses, and then let's just start with them. But then as soon, that was like the thought of a moment. And I think that it's partly, as Michael was saying, it's the fascination of this period and the realisation of how much it does influence our now. And yet no one seems to have any awareness of that. That really caught me. The other thing is good old Walter Bauer. I mean, you have this primary source of a man who lived through the events and chronicled them. And that section of Bauer's Scotic Chronicon, which of course is probably most of you know, but is a great epic that tries to kind of write a great slew of 1,000 years of Scottish history, it tries to cover. But the bit when he brings it up to the present day, and he says himself he didn't want to keep writing, but he kind of had to chronicle his own times. You're going, well, he actually saw James I, he actually probably stood in a room with him and shook hands with him, and that absolutely caught my imagination. And the King is queer. So suddenly I had these little windows that were really direct windows into people's minds back then, and that was irresistible. So that's why we started with James I.
Well, in this pause, may I ask something? Having read the summaries that you've done, it seems to me that, in fact, and this is fantastic, that the women have very big roles. And as we know, to coin a phrase, very often women are hidden from history. How did you, are there more little strands needing to be developed that you, in other words, have you made up more about the women? That's what I'm really saying. I think I'm sure that the drawing of the women is very important, and probably what I'm really asking is it harder? Was it harder to do the women, or did you actually? How did it happen? That's what I'm saying.
Harder and easier. Harder because there was less available to me. Easier because then I could make more up. So it was a similar process. I suppose I tried to get as much information as I could about what they might have been doing, and then from that thought, well, okay, so if you think that women then were probably basically the same as women now, what would that have felt like? What would they have really been doing? I think that, one example is Queen Joan, who, I tried to imagine her as, because she was only, 17, 18 when she was betrothed, but yet she was already being put in that position of running a household. So then you look into what running a household meant, and the vision, again, that we are all very much in love with is sort of medieval women in funny hats sitting in a window somewhere sewing, And in actual fact, you look at what the job of running a household was, especially a royal household. My God, you were busy because there was so much to manage. Now, how much did she do that directly and how much was that farmed off to servants? Well, that's like, you then go, well, even if she's farming it off to servants, someone has to tell them. And so the idea I came up with was thinking, well, she was probably like a very young PA, you know, or a party planner, or one of these people that's got to be juggling loads and loads of different things. There's the practicalities of feeding people. There's the diplomacy you're going to have, you know, of managing the kind of dignitaries that are coming to a royal court. There's just the whole the logistics of your own relationship with your husband, with the family relationships. And basically, I thought, well, if we assume she was very good at that, because we do know that James certainly gave her a lot of status and involved her quite directly in the business of government at times. Is that an exaggeration? Therefore, she must have been good at this. So then a personality develops out of that is not just a woman sitting in a window sewing. So I think the women in the play have been fleshed out in that way by gigantic leaps of imagination.
With Joan, there's also at least 7 pregnancies in 13 years, which is fairly impressive, I thought, in its own right. And I mean, I think traditional history has tended to downplay what is an exceptional cast of very impressive women in 15th century Scotland, not simply the queens, but noble women as well. And, for example, James I's sisters, Mary and Margaret, who, well, in Margaret's case, as a widow, as the Lady of Galloway, is administering great southwestern province of Scotland. His other sister Mary with 5 husbands, I think. But at the end of her life, you see her with children from all of those marriages around her, including Bishop James Kennedy of St Andrews, you know, the leading prelate in the kingdom. He's attending his mother, the Earl of Angus, one of the great noblemen of the kingdom as well. So these women independently have an identity, a purpose, their own place in the kingdom, their own type of authority. It's not the same kind of authority and the same kind of prestige, but it's very real, and it's being mediated in ways which is clearly understood and respected by men, by children, by husbands, by kinsmen. And the Duchess of Albany, I think, featuring your James I play?
Isabella,
yeah.
yes.
I mean, she sees her father, her husband, 2 of her sons executed by James I in 1424. She spends the next 13 years in close custody in Stirling Castle under James I's control. As soon as he's killed, she's released. She goes back to her ancestral province of the Lennox, north of Glasgow, and within months she's in control of that, surrounded again by a network of male kin. Her half-brothers, her illegitimate half-brothers, her grandchildren, they're all gathering from outside Scotland in some cases, back around her. And she takes control of that province, and the Crown is unable to get her out of it. James II, when he's an adult, can't get Isabella out of it, because presumably she has support. She has a network of supporters who regard her as a legitimate source of authority in that part of Scotland. So we're dealing with women whose role as independent players in political life, in social life, in the fabric of the kingdom is extremely strong, extremely important.
There's 2 here. This lady behind, and then Roy. Okay.
I wondered if each of the Jameses was influenced in any particular way by connections outside Scotland, or were they largely inward-looking in how their roles emerged?
They're very conscious of external roles, and I think in many ways that's why James I is such a transformative figure, because he leaves Scotland at the age of 12. He's being sent to France and is captured by English seamen en route to France. And the next 18 years is spent in England and in France as a captive of English kings. And so what he brings back to Scotland in 1424 is a perception of how you rule, which is drawn from outside Scotland. And I think his model for kingship, it's probably a kind of Stockholm syndrome, is Henry V of England, his captor. And Henry V is an extremely, some will say manically authoritarian king, a man who controls his kingdom extremely effectively, though he may be fortunate in dying relatively young in terms of that reputation. And James borrows in all sorts of ways, in his treatment of the church, in his use of parliament, in his financial policies, in his attitude towards the nobility. He borrows from Henry V. And part of what drives all three of these kings is a desire for recognition and respect on the European stage. And James I is extremely lucky in the sense that it's a period of 100 Years' War when England and France are extremely delicately balanced, and both sides are bidding for his support. And in 1428, he renews the French alliance on extremely favourable terms. His eldest daughter is to marry the heir to the French throne, the Dauphin Louis, and James is able to, if you like, develop very clearly as someone who, as King of Scots, is recognised as a European figure in a way that, from Robert Bruce through to himself, no Scottish king has been able to do, and particularly the early Stuarts, the first two Stuart kings, have no reputation of any sort in Europe. When they're described, it's in kind of almost pitying terms. So James I, James II and James III are all seeking, perhaps beyond the will of their subjects, to model themselves in a way and to borrow culturally from European models. They want a type of monarchy which is recognised as belonging to contemporary standards of kingship, the things they spend money on, palaces, artillery, ships. They're all the kind of trappings of monarchy that are transferable across Western and Central Europe. So as kings, they want to stand at the top table. They're very clear about that. So yeah, I think everything they do is informed by that sense of Europe and of participation in Europe. Because before that, actually, lots of Scots are involved with Europe, but the monarchy isn't. Far more, thousands of Scots are going abroad every year on various things as merchants, as soldiers, as mercenaries, as churchmen. But the kings aren't. The kings have no status in Europe. So that's desperately what all three kings want to do. James III, of course, wants to go to Europe, and his subjects say, no, you can't go. If they don't be stupid, you've got to stay at home and run the kingdom.
Thank you. Roy, would you like to?
How did you craft the plays with such a wealth of material? Did you sketch each play out and then return, or was it more linear?
Oh gosh. Well, from the beginning, I knew there was a possibility. They were commissioned as three plays, so I did work on them all simultaneously, without knowing they would ever be performed like this, but hoping they might. So I suppose I approached it as a big family saga, and then within that, I think it's like I was saying, you think, so what is the particular story of each? And then to serve that story, one sometimes has to take appalling liberties. Like, for instance, I was listening to Michael there, and I realised that my Isabella stays locked up till quite late in the reign of James II. However, for dramatic reasons that are...
I'll show you a charter.
Yeah, don't. Oh, well, we better talk about that afterwards. But it's then looking at you basically, you can't tell the story of all the history. So you inform yourself of as much of the history as you can. And then you think, so what's the human story that one's telling in the middle of all this? One of the actresses said something brilliant to me today. He said, the thing is, we're telling a story in history, not about history. So you're setting it in a particular moment, in a particular period. But James I is the story of one man's moral dilemma and his love for his queen. James II is about how children survive damage or don't. James III is another love story about, but what do you choose? Do you choose the person you passionately love, or what's a greater duty, if you like? So it's thinking of, what is so if you were to say, what was that play about in modern terms, you would have something to hang it on. And then I suppose one has to be quite ruthless in serving that second story end, as opposed to the history, which kind of makes a lot of decisions for you and what you use and what you don't use. There's whole swathes of characters that are now either off stage or footnotes, but hopefully, as I say, other people will then excavate the history and provide other stories.
Thank you. I think we've time for one more. This lady in the side.
Yes, I've bought tickets to all three, but I was just wondering, does each stand happily on its own? If I go just to the third, will I be comfortable? Will I be missing out on the antecedents?
Yes, absolutely, and they've been designed that way. You'd be missing out because they're epic. But not only are they comprehensible on their own, they're actually tonally very different. So that even the style of them is, even though we're using the same set and the same actors, there's quite a shift in the tone of them. So that James I is probably the most conventional narrative. And then James II has got some quite surreal elements, and James III is quite stylised in a different way. So that the experience of seeing each one should be, if we've done our job right, quite different. But also they can stand on their own.
Excellent. I don't know about you, but certainly I would like to see all of them now. I won't miss out a single one. Right, well, thank you all very much for that, and of course thank you to Michael and to Rona, but I'm going to invite Roy to come back to take us on to the next part.
Well, thank you very much. That was a fascinating discussion on both the historical context and how that material is crafted into the plays that we'll see in the summer. So please join me with a vote of thanks for Rona Monroe, Professor Jan Mcdonald and Dr. Michael Brown for this evening. Thank you. I'd also like to thank our partners, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and I was remiss at the top of the evening to mention that this was being audio recorded and a version will be available on the RSA's website in a couple of weeks' time. And so I really should just plug the production, which is Rona Monroe's James Plays. We open Sunday the 10th of August, and you can see all three in the day, and then you can see them consecutively through to the 22nd of August. And now I hope you'll join us for a drink, which I believe is upstairs. Thank you. Thank you very much.